Hello, you wonderful people. So for today's video, I'm going to talk about time skips in storylines. Obviously, this kind of is paired a little bit with the video I did a couple days ago where I talked about time frames, wanting to know the time frame in which stories take place, just because time skips are just such an interesting thing because obviously a lot of stories kind of keep it ambiguous about like how much time is in between stories. Like for example, I made a reference of like a season of a show can take place like immediately after, so a season can be about like moments after the previous season, or maybe in certain regards it's like, oh, like this has actually been 2 or 3 weeks. I mean, that's any frame of story. Sometimes stories will make a point to let you know, and I guess in some regards you can almost think of those as time skips, but what I'm talking about are kind of like the more bigger time skips, like when you kind of get into more bigger numbers, not necessarily like months, but in a year frame. Like a great example would be like, an example I feel like most people might know, but some people might not, is Naruto, for example. Naruto has a time skip in its storyline. I mean, well, there's multiple time skips actually, because I think near the end of Naruto, obviously it time skips to the current timeline of Boruto, I think. I don't know. I'm not that well versed at the end of Shippuden to like Boruto, like what the time frame in that regard is. But I'm slowly getting more acquainted. But that's a whole tangent in itself. But if you're unaware, after, I'll go ahead and say it because it's been long enough. After the Sasuke retrieval arc, there's a time skip. In the manga. It exists in the anime, but there's actually a bigger distinction in the anime than it is in the manga, because in the manga it's all one series of Naruto, whereas the anime is divided into the OG Naruto and Naruto Shippuden, which takes place after the 2-year time skip. And to me, I think time skips are such an interesting thing storytelling wise, because when like I said, when you make larger chunks of time skips, I mean, like I said, it can flow into months regard of like, oh, it's been like 6 or 7 months or something like that. But I think it's interesting when you make a point to do like years type of thing, because just what that represents storytelling wise, because it allows you to allow your characters to grow without having to be there like day in and day out to see that growth or what they've kind of gone through. An example would be Naruto. Like when you come back into that 2-year time skip to see Naruto older, see how much he's grown, but not just him, like every ninja in the Leaf Village, to see how much everyone's grown and changed, And I think that's such an interesting aspect to have for a story. Like another great example would be One Piece, because what separates One Piece's time skip from me than it does Naruto, because before I even watched Shippuden, I'd actually read up a little bit about it. So by the time I got to Shippuden storyline wise, like I was already aware a little bit of a lot of the stuff that was going on. One Piece completely surprised me, because the moment it got that point in the story and it's like, oh, the Straw Hat crew, I won't spoil the circumstances because it's actually a very impactful circumstances, but basically there was an arc where Luffy kind of was separated. Well, the entire Straw Hat crew was separated, and Luffy, there was a certain arc where Luffy had to do something surrounded by other people that weren't part of his crew to kind of do something very important to him. And it ends kind of tragically, and because of that, like Luffy made a decision that him and his crew were going to stay separated for 2 years and meet up later on, because they're going to work on getting stronger, so they never have to get, so that nothing and no one can ever separate them again. I don't know if there's been a subsequent time skip in the manga or the anime, because the last time I watched it was a couple years ago, after the Punk Hazard arc, which obviously is a little bit after obviously the time skip and everything. So I don't know if there's been one subsequently since, but to me that's one of my favorite time skips, just because of that once again, that element of seeing like how much the Straw Hat crew has grown, and it's just like to see, see a character like Usopp, how much he's grown, and like that sticks out the most, just because Usopp has always been kind of the coward of the team and stuff like that, always trying to pretend to be brave, but to see him kind of actually be tough, it's just like, it's so night and day to see how some, in certain regards, they're so the same, but also not. Like, it's just, that's probably one of my favorite points in the story, is just to be like, oh, because to me that series, in my opinion, gets better and better with every arc that passes. So when that time skip hit, I was like, oh my god, this is amazing. So I think it's just a fascinating thing of what you can accomplish. Obviously, a more recent one I've experienced that I really enjoyed was the time skip between Trails of Cold Steel 2 and Trails of Cold Steel 3, which, if you're unaware, is a 1-year time skip. And that feeling again, just seeing like where everyone is going. Because obviously you get filled in under certain big events, like obviously you learn about the Northern War that took place in between the 2 games. But other than that, there's still like, you know, I mean, and I think Code still kind of does that where it doesn't necessarily fill you in 100% about every single thing that went down in that time frame. Because I'm sure like in that year period, there's still like a lot they never really went into the ins and outs about. But just to see how much Reen as well as Class 7 has grown. Once again, Reen's a freaking teacher. Like, that surprised me because, once again, I would have assumed he would have gone down the bracer route, especially because Tova was constantly trying to recruit him. So I thought, like, you know, so to see him like a teacher, I mean, it makes sense, you know, what Sarah did to hit for him. He's passing on to the new generation of new Class 7, you know? So I think that's so fascinating to see. You know, once again, I made a whole video talking about Reen, who he is personality wise, like how much he has grown but also still had some growing to do in that time frame. Because I've also talked about this, you know, this is just more like, oh, like these are in the middle of a story type of time skips. You know, I referenced it a little bit with Naruto, but there's also the other form of time skips, which are usually saved for like the end of a series. For example, I know most recent one would be like iZombie. It's one I'm aware of where, spoilers, but not really spoilers, the finale, there's a 10-year time skip. It's not the entire episode, it's like the last couple minutes of the episode, which I remember someone leaving a comment on my review of it saying that they didn't like that because the time skip kind of came out of nowhere. It's like one thing happened, hard 10-year time skip, and it's just you get filled in a little bit. But I get it. Like if it was probably like a full episode dedicated, the person probably would have felt a little bit better about it, or at least there was at least more time dedicated to it, because I think it's just it being this like last minute thing in the episode, just because they already felt like a lot of the final season was rushed, and I think that just added more to that feeling for them. Because I can understand a time skip, you know, story frame wise in that regard, because it's an opportunity to be like, okay, you know, because a time skip at the very end of a series, like I said, Naruto kind of does it, but like I said, I'm not that well versed in it, but it's like letting you see where your characters are now, what they've gone through, you know, who's with who, and you know what their story is. So we get that a little bit in iZombie. I wish we had more time to live in that world, because obviously zombies had always at the end of season 3, but mainly most of season 4 was just kind of like, hey, this is what Seattle is. Wait, or am I? No, I think I'm misremembering. It's actually season 4 and most of season 5 dealing with the fact is that zombieism has no longer just been a Seattle thing, because most of the series it's just been a Seattle thing, but the outer world kind of learns about. So living in a world where zombieism is kind of more widespread and known a little bit more, I would have been curious to live in a world, but I still think it was a nice ending, kind of letting you get a peek into like, hey, the aftermath of where everything kind of stands. So that was neat, but I think I get the feeling of wanting kind of a little bit more. Another example would be Lost. Obviously, I won't get into the ins and outs of that, but that's a time skip situation. It's an interesting time skip situation because technically you kind of get the feeling like, oh, it's definitely a time skip situation, because like what the ending represents and all those characters being reunited, like the circumstances under which they're reunited kind of shows you like, oh, there has been a time skip that you kind of don't get filled in too much. To be fair, like the way they structure the final season is actually really interesting, like how what the flashbacks became for the final season, like, and what that means in the grand scheme of things, you know. Other than that, there's another show I'm aware of that kind of does a similar thing in that vein. I think it's 6 Feet Under. I've never watched the show, but I did have someone kind of explain the finale for me. At least I heard someone talk about the finale. I won't spoil it because, like I said, I don't know details, but the way someone was talking about it, it's basically kind of like you see where every character ends up, like you see kind of like their flashes of their life up until their deaths, as apparently how that finale works. Like I said, in the context of the show, I'm not really, you know, that means nothing. But still, just hearing that premise alone, I thought was kind of interesting. I mean, I think to a certain extent, and this can be kind of spoilers, Supernatural kind of does that too. It's kind of like a highlight reel of one character's life over the course of a time skip. I guess that technically counts as a time skip, but it's not the best example. One that I think is probably outside of the Cold Steel example, probably another one that really excites me. Well, obviously the One Piece one as well, but probably the MCU, because that was a time skip I wasn't expecting. Obviously in the context of like, obviously, you know, the 5-year time skip, I should have said spoilers because we were dealing with Endgame spoilers, but still, I thought that was so interesting because obviously a lot of people went into Endgame being like, I don't know what they're going to do, because the trailers kept it super ambiguous, so that when you got to the 5-year time skip, because it's like after they, spoilers, kill Thanos at the beginning, you're like, oh, where are we going from here? The Infinity Stones are destroyed, like what are you going to do 5 years later? And that time skip is so impactful just because of what it represents for the MCU going forward, because hey, literally half the universe got snapped out of existence and the other half had to live in that world. We hear about it a little bit in Endgame, like all that people had to do living on Earth. I think you get, I've only watched it once, so I have to go back, but obviously you have people like Rocket and Carol, Captain Marvel, on the more universal side of things, especially Carol, because I think she did a lot more universal travel than maybe Rocket did. I mean, we don't know the ins and outs of what they were up to those 5 years, but it's like, yeah, maintaining the peace and just like what each world was like in that 5-year time period, especially for other characters, because Far From Home tackles this a little bit, where it's like, oh, people have to come back to lives they haven't lived for the past 5 years because you just disappear, and now all of a sudden you're back, and it's like, oh, picking up your life after that. Like, so it's such an impactful 5 years, because that's a 5 years that will never be given back, you know, because like, once again, you having to live your life in that manner when half, you know, just on Earth alone, half the planet is gone, but then just in the universe, greater universe, half the universe is gone, and people kind of having to live with that for 5 years, and the struggles of that, but also the struggles of coming back after that 5 years to be like, wait, what's happening? What's going on? Wait, it's been 5 years. So to me, what that did storytelling wise is such a very impactful one. Because that's also another example of like, hey, I mean, because we don't know how long this MCU situation is going to go. Obviously, 23, we are currently up to 23 films. So, you know, who knows what the next potential 23 films are going to look like, you know? So you can make the argument that this time skip happened much like a Naruto or a One Piece, where it's like smack dab technically in the middle of a story, you know, not necessarily used at the end to like, I mean, to a certain extent, you can make the argument it kind of capped off certain people's stories, whether it be Steve Rogers or Tony's, but you know, legacies continue on and so forth. So those stories are capped off in certain regards, but because of their legacy, they continue on through characters like, well, eventually Riri for, you know, Tony, but also his daughter. But then you also for Steve, you know, it's Sam and Bucky, you know. So just certain things in that regard, I just think it's just a fascinating thing about, you know, time skips. I guess this video almost turned into some of my favorite time skips. I guess, I don't know. It was just meant to be like just a nerdy discussion about them. But obviously, you know, these are just some of the things kind of going through my head. I'd love to get to know some of your thoughts about time skips. Do you enjoy them? Like I said, I brought up some examples of where it's mainly used in the beginning of a story, but obviously it can be used in the end of the story, whether it be a lost situation or iZombie. Another one I didn't talk about was Grimm. Even Grimm, you only get like a tiny window of like a time skip years. It's like many years into the future, but we only get like a tiny glimpse. I wish we could have lived in that a little bit more, which, hey, you never know. Like, I don't think that's going to ever happen, but if they ever decided to reboot Grimm for whatever reason, you could continue down that path, but it probably told the story they wanted to tell. There's probably no going back down that route. I mean, if the opportunity presented itself, maybe something could happen there. Regardless, went on another tangent, but like I said, I presented these different time skips, like which ones do you prefer? What are some of your favorites? Maybe there's some that I mentioned, maybe there's some that I didn't mention that, hey, I should have thought about that because I forgot about it, or maybe it's just something I wasn't aware of. I would love to get to know your thoughts about everything. But really, that's all I want to talk about. Till the next time we meet, be happy, be safe, live life to the fullest, and enjoy it. Good day, and goodbye.